I needed this. A break from the relentless grind of city life, the incessant noise, the ceaseless demands. So here I was, driving my beat-up old Jeep down a dusty, narrow trail deep in the heart of the forest. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting long shadows that danced across my windshield. This was supposed to be my chance to find myself, to reconnect with nature and, hopefully, leave behind the anxiety that had been my constant companion for too long. The campsite was a good 2-hour hike from where I'd parked my car. It was remote, isolated, and perfect. I could feel the excitement bubbling up as I strapped on my backpack and set off into the wilderness. The trail was rugged but well-marked, winding through the towering pines and thick underbrush. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of moss and pine needles. This was exactly what I needed. As I walked, I let my mind wander. I thought about the mess I'd left behind at work, the arguments with my boss, the constant pressure to perform. But out here, all that seemed so far away, almost irrelevant. Here, it was just me and the forest. After an hour or so, I arrived at a small clearing by a gently babbling brook. It was idyllic, like something out of a fairy tale. I set up my tent and unrolled my sleeping bag, feeling a sense of accomplishment. This was going to be my sanctuary for the next few days. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I gathered some firewood and built a small campfire. The crackling flames provided a comforting glow as the forest around me grew darker. I roasted a few marshmallows and let myself relax, enjoying the peaceful solitude. But as the night settled in, that strange feeling crept over me again. It was as if the shadows were watching me, like the forest itself was alive and aware of my presence. I shook it off, blaming my overactive imagination. After all, I was alone out here. No one knew where I was, and that was the point, right? The firelight flickered, casting eerie shapes on the trees. I tried to focus on the sounds of the brook, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But then I heard something else, something that didn't belong. It was a faint rustling, followed by a low, almost inaudible growl. My heart skipped a beat. Probably just a raccoon, I muttered to myself, trying to sound convincing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, too menacing. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, my hand trembling. The beam of light cut through the night, illuminating the trees and underbrush, but revealing nothing. I took a deep breath and decided to call it a night. Tomorrow would be better, I told myself. I just needed to get some sleep. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight, feeling a bit safer inside the thin nylon walls. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening intently to every sound. The rustling had stopped, but the unease remained. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you and makes your ears ring. I checked my watch. It was just after midnight. Then I heard it again. That same low growl, but this time it was closer, much closer. I froze, my mind racing. What could it be? A bear? A wolf? I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't just lie there and wait for it to find me. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, ghostly glow. The forest beyond was pitch black, impenetrable. I stepped out, holding my breath, and shone my flashlight around. The beam caught something moving just beyond the edge of the clearing. My stomach lurched. There, standing in the shadows, were two glowing eyes, reflecting the light like tiny, malevolent stars. I gasped and stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The eyes disappeared, and the rustling sound started again, this time moving away from the camp. I stood there, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe it was just an animal passing through. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. I backed into the tent and zipped it up, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I needed to stay calm, to think rationally. But it was hard when every instinct was screaming at me to run. The rest of the night was a blur of fitful sleep and waking nightmares. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me, felt the presence of something lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. By the time dawn finally broke, I was exhausted and on edge. I stepped out of the tent, feeling the weight of the night lift slightly with the first rays of sunlight. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing, but the memory of those eyes stayed with me. I decided to shake it off and stick to my plan. Today, I would explore more of the forest, find that waterfall I'd read about, and try to enjoy my time here. But as I packed my day pack and set off down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. I walked faster, my senses on high alert, every rustle and snap of a twig making me jump. I reached a fork in the trail and paused, trying to remember the directions. Left to the waterfall, right back to the campsite. I took a deep breath and turned left, determined to find that waterfall and prove to myself that I could handle this. But as I walked deeper into the forest, the trail grew narrower, the trees thicker. The sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy, casting everything in a greenish gloom. I checked my map, but it didn't match what I was seeing. Panic started to set in. Had I taken a wrong turn? I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed different, unfamiliar. The path I'd taken seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the underbrush. I was well and truly lost. The sun was getting lower, and I knew I needed to find my way back before dark. I tried to stay calm, to think logically. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping to find something familiar. But the deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. As the shadows lengthened, I felt that same eerie sensation of being watched. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing. Just trees and shadows. But the feeling wouldn't go away. By the time night fell, I was completely lost and terrified. I found a small clearing and decided to make camp for the night, too exhausted to keep going. I built a small fire and huddled close to it, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. As the fire crackled and the darkness closed in, I heard it again. That low, menacing growl. Closer this time, almost as if it was circling the clearing, stalking me. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone my flashlight into the trees, the beam trembling in my hand. And then I saw them again. Those glowing eyes, watching me from the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out all over my body. I was not alone. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. The eyes disappeared, and the growling stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained. I huddled closer to the fire, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What was out there? What did it want? As the fire died down and the night grew colder, I knew one thing for sure: this was no ordinary camping trip. Something was out there, something that wanted me to know I was not welcome. And as the darkness pressed in, I realized with a sinking feeling that my journey had only just begun. I woke up with a start, the remnants of last night's terror clinging to me like a cold sweat. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only a few smoldering embers in the gray dawn light. The forest was eerily silent, and I could feel the tension in my muscles as I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The events of the previous night seemed almost surreal, but the fear was real enough. I needed to find that waterfall. It would be my touchstone, something to ground me in this vast, alien forest. The map had been useless, but I had my instincts, and I was determined to make the most of them. I packed up my meager camp and set off in what I hoped was the right direction. The air was damp and heavy with the scent of pine and earth. Every step I took felt amplified, the crunch of leaves underfoot a reminder of how alone I was. The trail had all but disappeared, replaced by dense underbrush and twisted roots that seemed to reach out and trip me up. As I walked, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in with a suffocating weight. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, my heart racing with each false alarm. The morning wore on, and the sun climbed higher, but its light did little to penetrate the thick canopy above. I reached a small stream and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me to the larger river that fed the waterfall. The water was clear and cold, and I took a moment to refill my canteen and splash my face. The brief respite was welcome, but it did little to ease the gnawing anxiety that had taken root in my stomach. As I continued along the stream, I began to notice strange markings on the trees. At first, they seemed like natural scars, but the more I looked, the more deliberate they appeared. Claw marks, deep and jagged, gouged into the bark as if some great beast had been here before me. The sight sent a chill down my spine, and I quickened my pace, trying to put as much distance between myself and whatever had made those marks. Hours passed, and the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. The stream twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the wilderness. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows that danced menacingly at the edge of my vision. I knew I needed to find shelter soon, but the landscape offered little in the way of safe havens. I was about to give up and set up camp for the night when I heard a faint, distant roar, unmistakable in its power. The waterfall. Relief washed over me, and I quickened my pace, the sound growing louder with each step. The terrain grew steeper, the underbrush denser, but I pressed on, driven by the hope that finding the waterfall would be the key to finding my way out. The roar of the water grew deafening as I pushed through a thick tangle of branches and emerged onto a rocky ledge. There it was, the waterfall, cascading down a sheer cliff into a deep pool below. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying in its raw power. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath and taking in the scene. The water crashed down with a relentless force, sending up a fine mist that hung in the air like a veil. The pool below was dark and foreboding, surrounded by jagged rocks and dense foliage. It was beautiful, but it was also a stark reminder of how far I was from civilization. As I started to make my way down towards the pool, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the rocky shore, were more of those claw marks, deep and fresh. And next to them, partially hidden by the underbrush, was a tattered piece of cloth, torn and stained with something dark. I knelt down to examine it, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone else been here before me? Had they encountered the same presence that had stalked me through the night? The implications were horrifying, and I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. Just as I was about to turn and run, I heard a low, guttural growl behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my ears, but saw nothing. The forest was still, unnervingly so. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Then, without warning, something lunged at me from the underbrush. I caught only a glimpse, a flash of dark fur, gleaming eyes, and sharp teeth before I was knocked off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing for anything to defend myself. My hand closed around a large stick, and I swung it wildly, desperate to keep whatever it was at bay. The creature snarled and retreated into the shadows, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. I didn't wait to see if it would attack again. I turned and ran, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I reached a small cave at the base of the cliff. I stumbled inside, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. The cave was shallow but offered some protection, and I collapsed against the rough stone wall, trying to calm my racing heart. Outside, the forest was silent once more, but I knew that the creature was still out there, watching, waiting. I huddled in the darkness, the reality of my situation sinking in. I was lost, alone, and being hunted by something I couldn't understand. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the entrance of the cave. I knew I couldn't stay here forever, but the thought of venturing back into the forest filled me with dread. I had to come up with a plan, but my mind was a jumbled mess of fear and exhaustion. As the last light of day faded, I heard the sound of footsteps outside the cave. They were slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel just beyond the entrance. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps drew closer, stopping just outside. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense with fear. The silence stretched on, and then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. I let out a shaky breath, but the fear remained. The cave was cold and damp, and the rock beneath me offered little comfort. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, a relentless drumbeat of fear that refused to subside. I huddled closer to the wall, my eyes darting to the entrance every few seconds, expecting those glowing eyes to appear at any moment. The footsteps had faded, but I knew better than to believe I was safe. Whatever was out there was cunning and patient, biding its time. I had to think, to come up with a plan. But my mind was a chaotic mess, fear clouding my thoughts. I had some supplies in my backpack: water, a few snacks, and a pocket knife. Hardly enough to defend myself, but better than nothing. I took a swig of water, trying to calm my racing heart. I needed to get out of this cave and find my way back to the trail, but the thought of venturing back into the forest filled me with dread. The hours ticked by slowly, each minute dragging on as I listened to the sounds of the night. The forest was alive with noises: rustling leaves, distant animal calls, and the occasional snap of a twig that sent my heart racing anew. But there was no sign of my stalker, at least not yet. As the first light of dawn began to creep into the cave, I knew I had to move. Staying here would only delay the inevitable. I gathered my things and took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. With the pocket knife clutched tightly in my hand, I stepped out into the cold morning air. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing but still unfamiliar. The events of the previous night played over in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I needed to find the main trail and get back to my car, but I had no idea which direction to go. I decided to follow the river, hoping it would lead me to some semblance of civilization. The sound of rushing water was a constant companion as I made my way along the rocky shore, every step a test of my nerves. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. I had been walking for hours when I stumbled upon the abandoned cabin. It was nestled in a small clearing, its weathered wooden walls covered in moss and vines. The sight of it filled me with both hope and dread. On one hand, it offered a potential refuge; on the other, it could be a trap. I approached cautiously, my knife at the ready. The cabin looked deserted, but I couldn't be sure. The door was slightly ajar, creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and musty, the interior dimly lit by the weak sunlight filtering through the grime-covered windows. The cabin was eerily well preserved, as if someone had lived here recently. There was a small table with a few chairs, a dusty old stove, and a single bed in the corner. But what caught my attention was the journal lying open on the table. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and began to read. The entries were written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The author, a man named Daniel, had been living here for months, documenting his descent into madness. He wrote of strange noises in the night, of feeling watched, and of a creature that stalked him through the woods. His last entry was dated just a week ago, and it ended abruptly, the final words trailing off into an ink blot. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that Daniel might have been the previous victim of whatever was out there. I needed to get out of here before I met the same fate. But as I turned to leave, I heard a noise outside. The growl, low and guttural, sent a wave of terror through me. I quickly shut the door and barricaded it with a chair, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the creature moving outside, its footsteps slow and deliberate. It was circling the cabin, testing the walls, searching for a way in. The minutes stretched into an eternity as I huddled in the corner, clutching the pocket knife like a lifeline. I could hear the creature's breathing now, deep and ragged, just outside the window. I forced myself to stay calm, to think clearly. There had to be a way out of this. Suddenly, the creature slammed against the door, the force of the impact shaking the cabin. I let out a cry of terror, backing away as the door creaked and splintered. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I had to act fast. I looked around frantically for something, anything, that could help me. My eyes landed on the stove, and an idea began to form. I grabbed the kettle and filled it with water from the small sink, then placed it on the stove and lit the burner. The creature was still pounding on the door, and I could see the wood starting to give way. The kettle began to whistle, the steam building up inside. I grabbed a rag and wrapped it around my hand, ready to use the scalding water as a weapon. Just as the door burst open, I swung the kettle, sending a stream of boiling water toward the creature. It let out a horrific scream, a sound that was almost human but not quite. The creature recoiled, thrashing in pain, and I seized the opportunity to make my escape. I bolted through the door, not daring to look back, and ran into the forest. My heart was pounding, my lungs burning as I pushed myself to keep moving. The forest blurred around me, the trees and underbrush a maze of green and brown. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get as far away from that cabin as possible. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, my legs giving out beneath me. I collapsed on the forest floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The creature's screams had faded, but the memory of its eyes, those glowing, malevolent eyes, stayed with me. As I lay there, trying to gather my strength, I knew that this was far from over. The creature was still out there, still hunting me. And I was more lost than ever, trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The forest had become my prison, and the unknown stalker my relentless warden. With a sense of dread settling over me, I forced myself to get up and keep moving. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had to find shelter, had to find some way to survive the night. But as I stumbled through the underbrush, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Night fell swiftly, cloaking the forest in darkness. The fading sunlight had barely managed to filter through the thick canopy, and now, under the cover of night, the woods transformed into an even more sinister labyrinth. I moved cautiously, every step fraught with tension, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. I had to keep going, had to stay ahead of whatever was stalking me. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and exhaustion, but I forced myself to focus. The memory of those glowing eyes and the creature's guttural growl spurred me forward. The forest seemed alive with noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling, distant animal calls. I strained to listen for the telltale sounds of my pursuer, but the cacophony made it difficult. My flashlight cast a weak beam, barely penetrating the darkness, but it was better than nothing. I stumbled upon a narrow trail and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me somewhere, anywhere but here. The trail was overgrown, and I had to push through thick underbrush, the branches clawing at my clothes and skin. The fear of being caught was a constant companion, driving me onward despite my fatigue. As I rounded a bend, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, was a shadowy figure, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It watched me with an unsettling intensity, its presence palpable. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. The creature stayed where it was, its eyes following me as I retreated. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward, and I bolted, my legs propelling me down the trail with a burst of adrenaline. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining on me with every step. The forest became a blur as I ran, my only thought to escape. I stumbled and nearly fell several times, the uneven ground and tangled roots threatening to trip me up. But I pushed on, driven by sheer terror. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest, away from any hope of rescue. As I rounded another bend, I saw a fallen tree blocking the path. Panic surged through me, but I had no choice. I scrambled over the trunk, my hands slipping on the damp moss. I could hear the creature getting closer, its snarls echoing through the night. I dropped to the ground on the other side and kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail began to incline, and I realized I was heading uphill. The exertion was taking its toll, my muscles burning with the effort, but I couldn't stop. Stopping meant certain death. The trail finally leveled out, and I found myself in a small clearing. The moon had risen, casting an eerie light over the scene. I looked around frantically, searching for any means of defense or escape. My eyes landed on a large boulder near the edge of the clearing, and an idea began to form. I ran to the boulder and crouched behind it, trying to catch my breath. The creature would be here any second, and I needed to be ready. I searched the ground and found a sturdy branch, gripping it tightly. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, and I knew the creature was almost upon me. My heart pounded in my chest, my palms slick with sweat. I steadied my breathing, trying to calm my nerves. This was it. I had to make a stand. The creature burst into the clearing, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It moved slowly, deliberately, its gaze locked onto me. I could see it more clearly now, a twisted, nightmarish figure, part animal, part something else entirely. Its fur was matted and dark, its claws long and razor-sharp. I waited until it was almost within reach, then swung the branch with all my might. The makeshift weapon connected with the creature's head, and it let out a pained roar, stumbling back. I didn't wait to see if it was down. I took off running again, heading for the opposite side of the clearing. I heard the creature recovering, its snarls growing more frenzied. It was angry now, and I knew I had only bought myself a few precious seconds. I crashed through the underbrush, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for rest. I stumbled upon another trail and followed it blindly, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze designed to trap and torment me. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. The trail led me to a dense thicket, and I pushed my way through, the branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I could hear the creature behind me, closer now, its growls a constant reminder of my impending doom. I emerged from the thicket into another small clearing, this one dominated by a massive tree with thick, gnarled roots. I hesitated for a moment, then scrambled up the roots, climbing as high as I could. The creature burst into the clearing just as I reached a sturdy branch, and I pulled myself up, panting and trembling. From my perch, I could see the creature below, pacing and snarling. It circled the tree, its glowing eyes never leaving me. I clung to the branch, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The creature let out a frustrated roar and slashed at the tree trunk, its claws leaving deep gouges in the bark. I knew I couldn't stay up here forever, but for now, I was safe. The creature couldn't climb, and the height gave me a small measure of security. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather my strength and clear my mind. The night stretched on, the moon casting a cold, silver light over the scene. The creature continued to prowl below, its eyes never leaving me. The first light of dawn brought little comfort. From my perch in the ancient tree, I could see the creature still prowling below, its glowing eyes locked onto me. The cold, silver light of the morning made the forest look even more otherworldly, as if I had been transported to a realm where shadows and nightmares reigned supreme. My body ached from the night's ordeal, every muscle protesting as I shifted my position on the branch. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. Sooner or later, the creature would find a way to reach me, or my strength would give out. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. I scanned the clearing below, looking for anything that could help me. The underbrush was thick, but I spotted a few sturdy branches and a large rock near the edge of the clearing. An idea began to form, a desperate, risky plan that might be my only chance. I waited until the creature was on the far side of the clearing, then slowly, carefully, began to climb down the tree. My movements were slow and deliberate, trying not to draw its attention. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I had to stay calm, had to stay focused. As I reached the lowest branch, I paused, gathering my courage. The creature was still pacing, its back turned to me. I took a deep breath, then dropped to the ground as quietly as I could. The impact jarred my bones, but I didn't stop. I grabbed one of the sturdy branches and the large rock, my mind racing. The creature heard me and spun around, its eyes narrowing. I didn't give it a chance to react. I hurled the rock at its head with all my might. The rock struck true, hitting the creature squarely between the eyes. It let out a pained roar, staggering back. Seizing the moment, I charged forward, swinging the branch like a club. The first blow caught the creature on the side of the head, and it let out another roar, this one filled with fury. It swiped at me with its claws, but I ducked, the air whistling past as its claws missed by inches. I swung the branch again, aiming for its legs. The creature stumbled, its balance thrown off by the blow. I took a step back, trying to catch my breath and plan my next move. The creature recovered quickly, its eyes blazing with anger. It lunged at me, and I barely managed to dodge, the branch flying from my hands. I was unarmed now, and the creature knew it. It snarled, advancing slowly, savoring the moment. My mind raced, searching for any possible way out. Then I remembered the kettle, the boiling water that had saved me before. I needed a distraction, something to buy me time. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the creature. It followed, its movements predatory, deliberate. I reached the edge of the clearing and grabbed a handful of dirt, flinging it into the creature's face. It roared in anger, shaking its head to clear its vision. I took the opportunity to run, darting back into the forest. My legs burned with the effort, my lungs screaming for air. I could hear the creature behind me, its footsteps pounding the earth, but I didn't look back. I had to find something, anything, that could help me. The forest blurred around me, my vision tunneling as I focused on putting as much distance between us as possible. I stumbled upon a small stream and followed it, hoping the water would mask my scent. The creature was still behind me, but its growls grew fainter as I pressed on. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and desperation, but I forced myself to think, to come up with a plan. I remembered reading about traps in one of the survival guides I'd studied before this trip. Simple, effective snares that could catch small animals or, in this case, slow down a larger one. I needed to find a place where I could set one up, and fast. The stream led me to a narrow ravine, its sides steep and rocky. I climbed down, using the rocks for support, and began to gather materials. Sturdy branches, vines, anything I could use to create a makeshift trap. My hands shook with fear and exhaustion, but I forced myself to work quickly. I found a suitable spot and began to set up the snare, using the vines to create a loop that would tighten if anything stepped into it. I covered the trap with leaves and branches, hoping it would be enough to catch the creature off guard. As I worked, I could hear the creature's growls growing louder. It had picked up my trail again. I finished the trap and backed away, my heart pounding. I needed to lure the creature into the snare, but how? An idea struck me, and I took off my jacket, tying it to a branch near the trap. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to catch the creature's attention. I climbed up the side of the ravine, finding a spot where I could watch the trap without being seen. The creature appeared moments later, its eyes scanning the area. It spotted the jacket and approached cautiously, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. My heart raced as the creature stepped closer to the trap. It hesitated, sensing something was off, but the lure of the jacket was too strong. It took another step, and the snare tightened around its leg. The creature roared in fury, thrashing against the vines that held it. I didn't wait to see if the trap would hold. I turned and ran, following the ravine as it wound through the forest. My legs felt like lead, my body ready to give out, but I pushed on. The creature's roars echoed behind me, but they grew fainter with each step. I stumbled upon another small cave and ducked inside, collapsing against the cool stone walls. My body was shaking with exhaustion, my mind a haze of fear and relief. The trap had bought me time, but I knew it wouldn't hold the creature forever. The cave was a temporary refuge, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. The creature's roars had faded, but its presence still loomed over me like a dark cloud. My body ached, and my mind was a jumble of fear and exhaustion. I needed a plan, a way to end this nightmare. I checked my supplies, a nearly empty water bottle, a few granola bars, and my trusty pocket knife. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I needed to find a way out of this forest, but first, I had to ensure the creature couldn't follow me. I ventured deeper into the cave, hoping to find another exit. The narrow passageways twisted and turned, the air growing colder and damper the further I went. My flashlight's beam flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the rough stone walls. Every sound echoed, magnified in the confined space, making it hard to distinguish between my own footsteps and those of something or someone else. After what felt like hours of navigating the labyrinthine tunnels, I emerged into a larger chamber. The air was heavy with moisture, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the space. I scanned the room, my flashlight revealing jagged rock formations and pools of stagnant water. But what caught my attention was the faint glimmer of daylight filtering through a narrow crevice at the far end of the chamber. Relief washed over me. An exit. I hurried toward the crevice, squeezing through the narrow opening. The sunlight was blinding after the darkness of the cave, and I shielded my eyes as I emerged into a dense thicket. The forest was quieter here, the oppressive silence amplifying my every movement. I knew I needed to put as much distance between myself and the cave as possible. The creature would eventually find a way to free itself from the snare, and I had to be long gone when it did. I followed a narrow deer trail, hoping it would lead me to safety. The underbrush was thick, slowing my progress, but I pressed on, driven by the knowledge that I couldn't stop. The trail led me to a small, overgrown clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling stone structure, perhaps an abandoned hunting lodge or a forgotten outpost. It was falling apart, but it offered a place to rest and regroup. I cautiously approached, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The structure seemed almost too perfect, too convenient. But I had no choice. I stepped inside, the air musty and stale. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the gaps in the stone walls. The floor was covered in debris, and broken furniture lay scattered around. I found a relatively clear corner and sat down, my back against the cold stone. As I tried to catch my breath, I heard a noise outside, a low, rumbling growl that made my blood run cold. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the creature had found me. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to think, to come up with a plan. I searched the room for anything that could be used as a weapon. Among the debris, I found a rusty old hunting knife and a broken rifle. The rifle was useless without ammunition, but the knife was still sharp enough to do some damage. I tucked it into my belt, feeling a little more prepared. The growling grew louder, and I knew the creature was getting closer. I needed to set a trap, something that would give me an advantage. I remembered the old snare trap and decided to recreate it, using the debris and vines from outside. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I worked quickly, setting up the trap near the entrance to the structure. As I finished, I heard the creature's heavy footsteps approaching. I backed away, taking cover behind a broken wall, and waited. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air was thick with tension, and every second felt like an eternity. The creature appeared in the doorway, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It sniffed the air, its gaze sweeping the room. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't see me. The creature took a step forward, triggering the snare. The vines tightened around its legs, and it let out a furious roar, thrashing against the restraints. I seized the opportunity, rushing forward with the hunting knife. I slashed at the creature's exposed flank, the blade cutting deep into its flesh. It roared in pain, its eyes blazing with fury. It swung its massive claws at me, but I ducked, narrowly avoiding the deadly swipe. I struck again, this time aiming for its neck. The creature howled, the sound echoing through the forest. It broke free of the snare, its eyes locked onto me with a murderous intent. I knew I couldn't take it head-on. I needed to outsmart it. I backed away, leading it deeper into the structure, hoping to trap it inside. The creature followed, its movements slower but no less deadly. I darted through the narrow passageways, using the structure's layout to my advantage. The creature crashed through the walls, its rage driving it forward. I led it to the back of the structure, where a small, unstable balcony overlooked a steep drop. I stood at the edge, my back to the abyss. The creature advanced, its eyes filled with a savage hunger. I had one chance. I waited until it was almost upon me, then dove to the side, grabbing onto the edge of the balcony as the creature lunged. Its momentum carried it forward, and it tumbled over the edge with a deafening roar. I pulled myself up, my heart pounding in my chest. I peered over the edge and saw the creature lying motionless at the bottom of the ravine. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I knew I couldn't stay here. The forest was still dangerous, and I needed to find my way out. The forest seemed to grow darker with each step I took, the trees closing in around me like a living, breathing entity. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and every rustle of leaves sent a shiver down my spine. The creature might have been defeated, but I knew the forest held more dangers. I needed to find my way out, and fast. I pressed on, following the narrow deer trail that wound through the underbrush. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. My senses were on high alert, every snap of a twig or distant call of an animal setting my nerves on edge. I had been walking for hours when I stumbled upon an old, overgrown path. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was a sign of civilization. My heart lifted with a flicker of hope. If I followed it, maybe it would lead me to safety. As I walked, the path grew more defined, the trees thinning out slightly. The feeling of being watched never left me, but I forced myself to stay focused. I had to keep moving. I couldn't let fear paralyze me. The path led me to a clearing, and in the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, the windows shattered and the door hanging off its hinges. But it offered shelter, a place to rest and regroup. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with dust. Broken furniture lay scattered about, and the floor was covered in debris. I searched the room, finding a few usable items: a rusty lantern, a frayed blanket, and a small, half-empty can of beans. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I lit the lantern, the weak flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. I sat down in a corner, wrapping the blanket around me, and tried to calm my racing thoughts. I had to come up with a plan, a way to get out of this forest and back to civilization. As I sat there, I heard a noise outside. My heart skipped a beat, and I grabbed the hunting knife, my eyes darting to the door. The growl that followed sent a chill down my spine. The creature was back. It had found me. I stood up slowly, my muscles tensing. The growl grew louder, more insistent, and I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't let it trap me in the cabin. I had to find a way to fight back, to end this once and for all. I looked around the room, my mind racing. There was a small window at the back of the cabin, partially obscured by a heavy curtain. It was my only chance. I moved quickly, pulling the curtain aside and prying the window open. The growling was right outside the door now, and I could hear the creature's claws scraping against the wood. I climbed out the window, dropping to the ground outside. I landed awkwardly, pain shooting up my leg, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the forest a blur around me. The creature's roars followed, echoing through the trees. I needed to find a place to make my stand, somewhere I could defend myself. The path wound through the forest, and I followed it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the creature behind me, getting closer with each step. The path led me to a rocky outcrop, a sheer cliff rising above me. I climbed, using the rocks for support, my hands slipping on the damp surface. The creature was right behind me, its growls filling the air. I reached the top and looked around, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. There, near the edge of the cliff, was a large, jagged rock. I grabbed it, the weight reassuring in my hands. The creature appeared at the base of the outcrop, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It snarled, leaping up the rocks with terrifying speed. I stood my ground, the rock held high. The creature lunged at me, and I swung with all my might. The rock connected with a sickening thud, and the creature let out a roar of pain. It staggered, but didn't fall. I swung again, aiming for its head. The creature's claws raked across my arm, and I cried out in pain, but I didn't stop. I brought the rock down again and again, each blow fueled by desperation. The creature roared, its movements growing more erratic. I could see the fury in its eyes, but also something else: fear. With one final, desperate swing, I struck the creature's head. It let out a final, anguished roar and collapsed, its body going limp. I stood there, panting, the rock slipping from my bloody hands. The creature was dead. I had won. I sank to my knees, the adrenaline leaving my body in a rush. The pain in my arm was sharp and insistent, but I ignored it. I had survived. I looked around, the forest silent once more. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the trees. I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to find my way out, but now I had hope. I stood up, the weight of the ordeal lifting slightly. The path stretched out before me, leading back into the forest. I took a deep breath and started walking, my steps sure and steady. The forest still held its secrets, but I was